So you've started to play more with aftermarket parts, and one of them is deciding that you're going to tune your recoil spring. But does that come at a cost? Now, the one thing I want to start this off with is that this is a very subjective thing, because you got to remember that different guns, different ammo can dictate different outcomes in addition to what you may want out of it. So tuning is for you. Secondly, this is hugely dependent on your grip and actual ability, because here's the thing. I can tune a gun perfect for me, but if the gun jumps around in your hands, well, you're not going to be able to do very much with it. And finally, you have to tune this to your gun that you choose to run, as well as know what ammo you do intend to shoot. Now, you can give yourself a little leeway if you decide to go a touch heavier on the recoil spring, but if you know exactly what ammo you're gonna run with the load specifications, you have to run that in your setup. Now, depending on what platform you choose, you can actually have more room for adjustability, which is why I decided to focus on recoil spring tuning only, because if you decide to run double action like I like to, you may not actually play with the mainspring. However, if you run something like a 2011, well, you can leverage not only the adjustability in the recoil spring, but as well as the mainspring, because you may not want to consider something as how much the pull is in double action. So this is why this particular platform is fairly popular for tuning and at the upper echelon of a lot of divisions. Now, one thing too is you are going to have to decide if you want to run an optic or not, because that is adding anywhere from about 1.5 to 2.5 ounces on top of your gun, especially on the part that is reciprocating, so you have additional weight to think about. Now, the most common way to tune a pistol is for doubles. What does that mean? Well, that means one sight picture and 2 trigger pulls. Essentially, you're tuning for a fast and predictable return to zero when you pull the trigger really quick. Now, that's big when you start to shoot like open and major, or even just general minor scoring, depending on your preference. Now, what I actually ended up deciding to do this video is because I'm shooting at 90 PA, which you do get heavily penalized if you decide to shoot really fast and not accurately. So what I ended up doing is taking a method from Tom Castro, in which he throws 10 shots and you are shooting as quickly as you can see the sights accurately with the tightest group. And the idea of that is that you can actually visually see where your sights are settling and what cadence and pace you can actually push this gun at and get very tight grouping, which is critical in the game of IDPA specifically, or even for the guys shooting minor in USPSA. Now, I do have a video of which I did 7 different recoil spring tests with the Shadow 2 Compact on my B channel, the Anti-FUD Armory, so you can check that out. You can actually see the cadence and pace I was using, as well as what the return looks like. Now, it's important to see that too, because a lot of times if you have the ability and opportunity to shoot in slow motion, you can see how the return is coming back. Because if the gun comes back in battery and there is quite a bit of dip, that's usually a symptom of a fairly heavy sprung gun, which most guns from the factory will tend to be this way. Now, you can in fact be too light, and what that tends to look like is when it returns zero, your second shot or follow-up shots end up being a touch high, because essentially what's happening is the gun is coming back so hard that by the time it starts to ease back out, your muscle memory may be telling you to already fire. So this is why it's important to pay attention to what the muzzle is doing, and as well as where this tracking is happening. Now, all this effort and the way this gun feels and shoots is nothing without reliability. Now, what you end up paying attention to is how the ammo is extracted, because if it's dribbling out, that's a high likelihood that you will have a malfunction when you go to actually shoot a stage. And I had a few of those happen to me, because what shows up good on paper and in front of me, when you start to swing the gun around, you can in fact start to induce some malfunctions like I did in a few cases where I had a stovepipe. So the ideal set is that you want to have at least both a consistent ejection out and as well as where they're landing. Now, bear in mind though, when you start to venture down this road, especially if you're running a softer recoil spring, you are going to be harder on equipment, so you're just going to have to keep that in mind. One thing I like to do is think about how often I replace slide stops and also double check what the barrel lugs look like or anything else for that matter. The final thing to pay attention to, and this ties into reliability, is that you can knock this out of battery. Most common time I actually see this is when there's a closed port and you decide to push it down with your muzzle, essentially knocking out a battery. And if you have one of those activators that in turn presents a target that goes away, that is huge points you can lose. Now, I did mention earlier that I was using a Shadow 2 compact that I was tuning for IDPA. To give you guys some reference, that ammo is specifically about 114 power factor versus the typical minor load that's around 125 to 130. So there was definitely a drop in amount of power and velocity that was output. So in fact, it did call for a need to tune the recoil spring. Now in this case, I did choose 7 different setups here to actually see what it was all about. One being the captured stock recoil spring and guide rod. The second being a DPM setup, which is a 2-stage spring setup in which you have an external spring, which is typically lighter. And the final one I chose was an uncaptured guide rod setup in which I use an 11 and 13 pound recoil spring. I'm going to provide you guys the executive summary on that gun just to show you where I landed with and what you need to think about. Now, before I do that, I ask if you like this video, please hit that like button, as that really helps me a lot. And you're going to want to subscribe because this is essentially part of the journey that I went on with the Shadow 2 compact. And one part of that I evolved into was switching platforms. So if you are thinking about which platform to choose, or you have to figure out what you need to do to adapt to a new platform, you're going to want to subscribe when that video drops. All right, so I'm just going to provide an executive summary for you on what this gun did and the behavior it emitted. Now, starting with the stock spring, you can see that with Blazer 115 aluminum that this gun cycles ideally. Now, here's the thing. I was going about as quick as the information my sights could tell me, which when I play this in real time, that cadence isn't very quick. Now, this is why you start to look at lower power factor ammo, is to see if you can in fact move your cadence up while maintaining accuracy. And as you can see, I was able to shoot quicker because the information I received in my hands and sights informed me I could, but I could not get the grouping out of it. In addition to that, while it felt nice, there was a high probability that this thing would in fact have a malfunction. As you can see, it doesn't even go all the way back to the slide stop. So when you're short stroking like that, you may induce a stovepipe. So that was already out. Now, going with the DPM setup, which is a very, very popular setup on a lot of guns, the one thing that's interesting is because I'm running lower power factor ammo, the stiffer spring in it was just a touch too heavy. So while the initial opening up would be good, it would be going all the way back, which would be slowed down tremendously. So here's the thing, how that felt in the hands, it felt incredibly soft. The problem with that is that its return felt awkward. Now here's the thing, this is why you look at different validation points. On paper, with specifically the short gold external spring, I was putting out tight groups and maintaining that pace, but that was more of what my hands were telling me to do and not necessarily what my sights were telling me to do. And if you're following along, I am tuning this to see what my sights look like. So this would be ideal if I was doing maybe a doubles type of tuning and focusing on hammered pairs, but this is not for me. Where I ended up landing for this day was using an 11 pound recoil spring with an uncaptured guide rod setup, as there was a fairly consistent cycle, and while the group wasn't as tight as perhaps that DPM setup, I could track my sights fairly well and I was producing for me what was an acceptable group. Now what's interesting is in slow motion, it arguably has the highest muzzle rise of anything I've put on the table. And guess what, guys? I don't tune for muzzle rise because what may happen sometimes is that the slide is coming back very quick, but in return, returning back to zero even quicker. So that's why I try to advocate and tell you guys 1,000 times that muzzle rise is something you just need to get over and focus on how quick it returns to zero. And if we were going by muzzle rise, there'd be a lot of hurt feelings on here. One thing I really didn't think about, because I was fine with how it was shooting, was how far it was going back. Here's the thing, it wasn't going back fast enough, and one thing I didn't pay attention to was how far the rounds were ejecting. What was happening was that rounds were fairly erratic in which way they decided to go, and as well as where they were landing. So what that means for me is I may not have enough velocity going back, and that makes sense because I'm not exactly opening up all the way. Now here's the thing, while it ran well in the straight line testing, only in the actual match where you can start to introduce different variables, and in this case where I just barely touch a slide, it's really easy to induce a malfunction. So I actually decided to take this a step further and start to cut coils out of the recoil spring. And where I landed with is using the 11-pound recoil spring and cutting out 2 coils. Now at that point, I had this thing cycling perfect and consistent. And here's the thing, I only had a week before IDPA Nationals before this happened, but at that point I was confident as I ran it in 2 more matches and had 0 issues. So what are some of the takeaways on this? Well, if you want to do doubles tuning, you certainly can do that. If you're definitely running any type of major scoring, I would heavily lean on that. In fact, I'm going to leave a link below for John Vlieger. He is a USPSA GM and arguably one of the top 10 shooters in the US, and he has a pretty good video on how he tunes it. And as well as I'll leave Tom Castro's video on it, so you guys can have a perspective other than mine from 2 very, very high level shooters. Now, if you have 2 guns that are exactly the same, so meaning that they're within 1 serial number apart from each other and tuned exactly the same, do be careful of the power factor for that, because I've had 2 identical guns have anywhere from 20 to 30 feet per second difference in the velocity it exits at, so do pay attention to that. After all this effort and discussion, I've talked about this, don't obsess over it. It is critical that you go out and practice, whether that's tons of dry fire if you do not have the money for ammunition, or if you do, get out there and get your fundamentals perfect before you dive into this. Because if you do not have the grip, the ability to extrapolate your newfound performance modification, it is an absolute waste of time, and it is also a distraction. That is coming from a place of hard lessons. So until then, guys, I will see you all at the range.